Dr. Roberts has consistently voiced concerns about the strength of the U.S. economy, about corporatism in the U.S. and politics, and about U.S. civil liberties. Now, Roberts is a co-founder of Reaganomics and has also been an editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Businessweek, and Scripps Howard News Service, amongst many other publications. Now, when we last spoke, a lot of his energy was focused on the economic and employment challenges facing America's middle class. So I asked him what he would do if he could implement just one or two fixes to help American middle classes, and here's his response.
You know, I think I would let the handful of big banks fail, because then the Federal Reserve could stop the quantitative easing, the purpose of which is to support the balance sheets of the handful of banks. And if it stopped quantitative easing, it would stop undermining the dollar. The real danger that Americans face, on top of the loss of their middle-class jobs abroad, is the collapse of the dollar. Because if the dollar collapses on top of the loss of jobs, and it's now such an import-dependent economy, the living standards would be pummeled. People would be just desperate. So that's the first thing I would do. I would let the banks fail. We don't need to prevent markets from working by printing huge sums of money every month to support the balance sheet of banks, when that very printing of money undermines the dollar, and it will eventually undermine the dollar. The other thing I think I would do is to change the way U.S. corporations are taxed. I would force them away from offshoring by taxing them on the basis of where they produce their product. If they produce in the United States, they would be taxed at a low rate. If they produce in China or India or abroad for the home market, they would be taxed at a high rate. So that's the only two things I can think of.
Two very good things and an interesting perspective. Now, one refrain that we heard during the financial crisis was that government allowed private gains to be offset via public losses by massive bailouts. Here's the question. Now, in a globalized world, does this undercut the notion that free movement of labor and capital produces the greatest welfare for the greatest number of people?
Of course it does. Look, global capitalism does not produce welfare for anybody except for a few giant firms. What globalism is, it's a way to impoverish first world labor and to turn agriculture in third world countries into monocultures for export. And so you destroy the self-sufficiency of peoples in the less developed economies, and you destroy the self-efficiency of the workforce in the developed economies. And the only gainers are a few big banks and a few big corporations. And there's absolutely no reason that the economy should be run for the benefit of a handful of mega-rich banks and corporations.
Now, what about dealing with wages directly? Now, for example, a recent guest that we had on the program, Scott Sumner, he said that he supports wage subsidies as a way to deal with low wage growth and unemployment, and others support having government create buffer stocks, that's just a term, buffer stocks of jobs instead of unemployment benefits. And yet others, they support higher minimum wages. What's your answer to the problem?
Well, I think I've already given it. It's to force the corporations to bring the jobs back here. You see, what has happened since the Soviet collapse is that China and India opened their labor markets to first world capital. So the goods made by American corporations, for example, for sale to Americans, that is the goods they make to market here in the United States, they now make those abroad. So this separates the people from the production of the goods and services that they consume. In other words, their incomes are no longer related to the goods and services that they purchase. And so this destroys the domestic purchasing power and destroys the ability of real income growth in the United States. So this has to be altered dramatically, or else the United States is going to become an undeveloped country. You're not a developed country when you can't make anything. And when you hire all your engineers and researchers and designers abroad. So the United States has been on the path now for 15 years, maybe longer, of becoming a third world country. And so the notion that it's some kind of a superpower is a joke. It doesn't have an economy. There's been no income growth for the vast bulk of the people for years.
That's a scary thought for many Americans. I'm going to ask you, just kind of to sum it all up, what's your forecast for the American economy in 2014?
I think this year it will turn down further. They try to spin all the bad news and turn it into good news. They can always take some poor indicator and say, oh, look how good things are. I think that's going to run out on them this year. It could go on another year. Another difficulty is the dollar itself. The only way they can now keep the dollar's value up is by manipulating the price of gold. They drive down the price of gold by selling futures contracts, which trigger stop-loss orders, margin calls. So every time gold starts up, they start hitting it with lots of naked short selling in the paper gold market. Well, I think that they're running out of the ability to do this. People are catching on, as well as just the gold stocks available in the United States or anywhere in the West have rapidly diminished. So the dollar is going to be, or the dollar could become a serious problem for them. Earlier this month, the dollar fell below the index reading of 80, which is a danger sign. Now, they were able to pump it back up, but still, the natural inclination seems to be to push the dollar down. And so how long they can fight these tendencies. And as the BRICS, the big countries in the world, move away from the use of the dollar, this will put more pressure. So I would expect they could have two kinds of troubles. One, rising problems with keeping the dollar's value up, and rising problems with keeping the economy from collapsing further. So I think that's the problems they face this year, if not this year, certainly next year.
The second half of our interview was dominated by Ukraine because Dr. Roberts recently wrote a scathing article about what he deems to be the looting of Western Ukraine. Now, in our interview, he gave full voice to the ideas behind that article and then some. And I first asked him to explain why an IMF loan agreement is Western looting if Ukraine is getting a bailout to support economic reforms. Take a look at what he had to say.
Well, they're not getting a bailout. You see, what IMF loans do, in fact, Ukraine will never see a dollar of that money. What the IMF will do, it will take the money and give it to the private banks who are the creditors of Ukraine. So the IMF says, okay, Ukrainian government, we're going to pay off these banks for you. So the banks then write down their loans to the banks, to Ukraine, by the amount that the IMF gives them. And then the IMF tells Ukraine, okay, now to pay us back, so that you'd be able to pay us back, this is what you have to do. You have to cut old age pensions. They're talking about cutting them by 50%. You have to cut social services. You have to cut all the subsidies to consumers, such as the 50% subsidy of the natural gas price. You have to lay off X amount of government workers. You have to sell state-owned assets to private companies in order to get more money to pay us off. And then what happens is the big Western companies go into Ukraine, they buy up the industries, American agribusiness will end up with the Ukrainian farmland, and the country simply is owned by foreigners. This is the way the IMF plans always work. The first thing you do is Western banks get some poor government so indebted that it can't pay, and yet it can't default because its credit rating collapses, and it's now dependent on this flow of outside money. So the private banks get the country indebted, and then the country can't pay, so in comes the IMF, and that's the procedure I described. It always works this way. No country has ever benefited from an IMF loan.
Now, Latvia also received an IMF loan under conditions of austerity, and GDP plunged and unemployment as well. That skyrocketed. Now, many people emigrated, but as difficult as this period was economically, some observers are now saying that Latvia represents a model in Eastern Europe, and now they're a part of the EU. So here's the question, is Latvia a model here or not? What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, it's a model of why you should never join the EU and never take an IMF loan. Latvia is a good model of that. Look, we've got Russian people here who had to flee the lack of any jobs or opportunity. There were Russians who lived in Latvia. They were Russian people, but it was all, in a sense, part of the Soviet Union, so they were there. And consequence of this IMF is their life was restored. They're here now.
There you go. Now,
there you go.
I want to ask you, in 5 years, where do you see the Ukrainian political economy?
Oh, it's not even clear that the breakup of the Ukraine is over. It really consists of two different countries. A large part of what is currently Ukraine is former Russian territories that various Communist Party leaders stuck into Ukraine. Lenin stuck a lot of eastern and southern Ukraine were former Russian provinces. And of course, Khrushchev stuck Crimea in. Well, Crimea is departed, but you've got a lot of the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, which are essentially Russian territories. They speak Russian, they're Russian peoples. And if this stooge government that the Obama regime has installed in Kiev continues its aggressive words and deeds against the Russians living in Ukraine, I think you'll see more of the country break away. So we don't even know to what extent in fact, there's no elected government in Ukraine. It's a stooge government imposed by Washington. So until they have an elected government and we see what its behavior is, we can't even assume that the Ukraine is a coherent entity.
Paul, are you afraid that military confrontation or civil war even could be potential outcomes in Ukraine?
I think that the Ukraine is very dangerous because of the recklessness on the part of the United States. For the United States to go into a territory that for 200 years was part of Russia, had Russia's Black Sea naval base. The people in Ukraine have relatives in Russia, Russians have relatives in Ukraine, and for the Obama regime to go in there and tear up this relationship, install a stooge government with the intention of having the Russians kicked out of their Black Sea naval base and with the intention of putting missile bases on the Ukrainian border with Russia. This is reckless. This takes a direct strategic threat to a major military power. Russia is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not Syria. So I think it's extremely dangerous. I don't think a civil war will occur in Ukraine if we can believe Putin. He said that if they mistreat the Russian populations, in goes the Russian army. Well, of course, the Russian army goes in, there's nothing Ukraine can do about it, or for that matter, anybody else. So if the stooge government persists in persecuting the Russian residents in the Ukraine, that, I think, will cause a further territorial loss, and that other of the former Russian provinces will return to Russia. Now, whether the West, whether NATO and the United States would try to intervene, it would be an act of madness. But of course, they consistently show bad judgment. What is the point of antagonizing Russia by taking a direct strategic threat to its backyard? There's no reason to do that. And so when you have this type of recklessness in the West, and supported by the media, supported by the NATO puppet states, this is a very dangerous situation.
So, Paul, I want to end with this question. What, in your opinion, would be the right response by the West to help reduce corruption, institute reforms, and support a democratic and economically prosperous Ukraine?
Look, the West is as corrupt as anybody. And the whole purpose is, the economic purpose, apart from the political purpose I just discussed. The economic purpose is to loot Ukraine. They're not interested in a prosperous Ukraine. Who has ever prospered from an IMF? We just had recently the report issued by the EU itself, by the European Union itself, that there was enormous corruption throughout the EU, and that the losses from this corruption was equal to the gross domestic product of Ukraine.
Wow.
So what are you talking about free of corruption? I mean, the United States government's totally corrupt. The whole economic policy is run for a handful of banks.
That was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Time now for today's Big Deal.